Welcome to this presentation on sleep and dreaming. We're not only going to talk about dreams in this segment, we're also going to talk a little bit about theories about why we dream, and we're going to talk a little bit about the effects of sleep deprivation. But let's focus on dreaming first. Do dreams really mean anything? Psychologists are really divided on this question, and if you're a Freudian or any kind of psychoanalyst, you in fact think that dreams are extremely important. We talked about this a little earlier in the term when we were doing the module on Freud's theory of personality. But if you'll recall, Freud thought that the dream had two different types of content. The manifest content of the dream is what the dream seems to be about on the surface. So if you have a dream that you're riding on a train at night and there's a giraffe reading a newspaper in the seat next to you, that's the manifest content of the dream. The latent content of the dream, on the other hand, is the hidden meaning, the thing that our ego is trying to protect us from, the stuff that would be so disturbing if we really knew about it that we're protected from understanding that. And so we dress it up and disguise it by symbolism. So our dreams are full of symbols that represent other things. So the manifest content of the dream is the surface story. The latent content of the dream is what it's really about. We'll return to Freud's theory in more detail in a moment. Other psychologists don't think that dreams have such deep meaning, although they're certainly interesting. According to the activation synthesis theory, what's going on when we dream is that our cortex is valiantly trying to make sense out of random brain activity while we're sleeping. When you go to sleep, your brain just doesn't turn off, but the pattern of activity changes, and neurons are firing, and memories are being stimulated, and sensations are being processed, and the cortex takes all of this random activity and tries to tie it together and have it make some kind of sense. And the dream is sort of the outcome of that. Neurocognitive theory takes a slightly different perspective and proposes that what's really going on when we dream is that we're just thinking under very different circumstances than we think when we're awake. When we're awake, we're getting a lot of sensation from the world. We have a pattern of cortical activity that's very different than what's going on when we're sleeping. And we have a lot of voluntary muscle movement going on that feeds back into our consciousness. So you take all those things away, and when a person is asleep, you've got a whole different ball game. And according to neurocognitive theory, dreams are the outcome of this thinking under very unusual circumstances. So both activation synthesis theory and neurocognitive theory find dreams to be interesting and the result of brain activity, but unlike Freudian theory, they don't propose that there's all kinds of deep hidden meaning going on. So let's return to the questions of, do dreams really mean anything? As I said, psychologists are already somewhat divided about this, and some psychologists think that dreams really don't mean anything more than random brain activity, but a lot of people accept the perspective of people such as Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung that dreams can reveal a person's deepest unconscious wishes and desires. In a nutshell, psychoanalysts such as Freud and Jung believe that we disguise disturbing impulses by substituting more acceptable symbolic objects to stand in for the latent content of our dreams. Freud wrote about dreams in many different places, most notably in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. According to Freud, the number of things represented by symbols in dreams is not great. The human body, parents, children, siblings, birth, death, nakedness, and a few other things. The person as a whole is often represented in the form of a house. Houses with smooth walls are men, and those with projections and balconies to which one might cling are women. Parents appear in dreams as kings, queens, or other highly respected persons. Children and siblings are symbolized by small animals or vermin. Birth is almost always represented by some reference to water. Either one plunges into water or climbs out of it, rescues someone from water or gets rescued from water, indicating a mother-like relationship to that person. Death is replaced in dreams by taking a journey. Nakedness is symbolized by clothing, especially uniforms. The richest collection of symbols, however, is reserved for the sphere of sexual life. According to Freud, the great majority of symbols in dreams are sex symbols. The number 3 is a symbolic substitute for the entire male genital, whereas the penis alone is represented by long and upright objects such as sticks, umbrellas, poles, trees, or the Washington Monument. It can also be symbolized by objects that can penetrate the body and cause injury. Think of knives, daggers, lances, swords, and firearms, especially revolvers, in this regard. Also substituted for male genitalia are objects out of which water flows, such as faucets and fountains, or objects that can be elongated, such as telescopes and collapsible pencils. In the words of the old song by folk singer Melanie, anything that is longer than it is wide can be a phallic symbol. The extraordinary characteristic of an erection, in which the penis raises itself against the force of gravity, results in symbolic representation by balloons, airplanes, missiles, and rockets. In some cases, the entire person becomes a representation of the sex organ if the person pictures himself flying. Other less obvious male symbols include reptiles, especially snakes, and fish, hats, and coats. The female genitals are symbolically represented by objects which enclose a space capable of being filled by something. For example, pits, caves, bottles, boxes, trunks, jars, suitcases, pockets, ships, the mouth, churches, and shoes. Wooden and paper objects are symbols of women, whereas breasts are represented by apples, peaches, and fruits in general. Jewels and treasure may represent a beloved person, while sweets frequently stand in for sexual delight. Masturbation may be disguised as sliding, coasting, or tearing branches off of trees. Dreaming of one's teeth falling out or being pulled out indicates a fear of castration as a punishment for masturbation. Sexual intercourse may be symbolized by an array of scenes and interaction between male and female symbols. As much fun as all of this is, always keep in mind that a Freudian analysis of dreams is not simple. It takes many years of training to understand the factors that need to be taken into account to conduct a proper interpretation of dreams. And after all, as Freud himself once supposedly said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. I know that I just went through a very long list of symbols and what they all stand for. In this class, you do not have to know any of that. This was just for entertainment. It's fun to talk about these things. I want you to understand that Freud believed that dreams did have a much deeper and important meaning. I want you to understand the difference between the manifest and latent content of dreams, but I promise I will never be asking you any questions about what one kind of symbol stands for in a dream. So, sleep is obviously important. We spend about a third of our life asleep, but curiously, we don't really know for sure why we sleep, but there are a variety of different theories. One theory is that sleep is necessary for the development of the brain. It solidifies information from the day, it helps tissue growth, and therefore we need to sleep so that our brain can continue to grow. Some evidence that's consistent with this is if you look at the difference in REM sleep patterns between infants and older people. A brand new infant engages in REM sleep for about 70% of the time that the infant is asleep. But by the time the infant is 6 months old, this has dropped down to 30%. And by the time you get into old age, you only spend about 15% of the night in REM sleep. One of the explanations for this could be that the newborn infant is obviously processing a lot of brand new information and learning a lot of new stuff. Later in life, most of the stuff that's going on isn't brand new, and so you don't need to process that much new information. We don't really know for sure, but this is one of the ideas about why we sleep. Another perspective on why we sleep is known as repair and restoration theory. The idea is that during the day, there's a lot of wear and tear on the brain. It's working overtime to accomplish so many different tasks. And when we're asleep is when the brain sort of takes out the garbage, cleans out everything, flushes the system with spinal cord fluid, and gets ready for the next day. The analogy I like to use in my class is to think of it as a football stadium. When the football game is going on and the place is packed with fans, there's a lot of beer being spilled and litter being thrown around, and the place is getting messed up during the game. After the game is over and the fans all file out, there's a big mess to be cleaned up, and the crew comes in and wipes everything down and sweeps everything up and gets rid of the trash and litter so that it's ready for the next game. Well, repair and restoration theory proposes that sleep is kind of like the cleanup crew in the stadium. During the day, when the game is going on, so to speak, everything is getting used and dirtied up, and then we go to sleep and everything gets cleaned out so you're ready for the next day. There's also an evolutionary perspective on sleep that's sometimes referred to as the energy conservation theory. The idea is that we sleep because it's been adaptive for us to do so. Back in our prehistoric days when we were evolving, not that we aren't still evolving, but presumably people who got the right amount of sleep did better than people who did not. Perhaps people who spent too much time walking around in the forest at night didn't do very well because there were too many predators and enemies out there waiting to get them. So sleep was a way of staying out of trouble. You went to a hidden place and disappeared for 8 or 9 hours. And also, you're saving energy. If you're moving around 24 hours a day, you're burning a lot of calories. And at a time in our history when calories were sometimes hard to come by, there would have been a real advantage to being a little more efficient with it. So another perspective on why we sleep is simply that it's been adaptive because it was safer for us and also a more efficient way to use energy. I don't think that these different theories are necessarily in competition with each other. We may sleep because all of these things are happening. So what happens when we're deprived of sleep? Well, there are no major effects of sleep deprivation up until about 24 hours. So if you pull an all-nighter and are up for 24 hours in a row, you may feel a little groggy and out of sorts, but you are not maybe seriously impaired. And you might even find you get a lift a little bit the next morning when your circadian rhythm kicks in, even though you haven't gotten any sleep. But the longer this goes on, the more you start to notice certain things declining. Your mood gets less pleasant, so you become sort of depressed and slow moving. Your ability to perform on tasks is damaged, especially what we call vigilance tasks. Tasks that require you to pay attention to detail, tasks that require you to detect things going on around you. One of the reasons it's so dangerous to drive when you're sleep deprived is because driving is very much a vigilance task. You're constantly scanning your environment for pedestrians and other traffic and signals and signs. And a person who is sleep deprived is just as dangerous behind the wheel as a person who's drunk. You also don't want somebody sleep deprived if they're working as an air traffic controller, for example, whose job it is to monitor the position of dozens of airplanes at a time to avoid accidents. Very prolonged deprivation, more than 120 hours or so, can lead to hallucinations and all kinds of behavior that appears to be psychotic. If you merely deprive people of REM sleep, the only noticeable effect is they become irritable. So if you let the person in the sleep lab go to sleep and then wake them up every time you notice that they're lapsing into REM sleep, they still get a night's sleep, they just don't get enough REM sleep. The person is pretty irritable the next day. And this doesn't happen if you deprive them of sleep from other stages of sleep. You also rebound. If you've been deprived of REM sleep, on subsequent nights you actually engage in more REM sleep than you ordinarily do. Interestingly, our basic metabolic processes seem to be completely unaffected by a lack of sleep. So no matter how long you're up, your heart keeps beating, your lungs keep working. All of the things that keep you alive don't seem to depend on getting sleep. By the way, the record for going without sleep is about 11 days. It was done by a college student, and frequently other college students try to break that record, but for now, that's the record that stands.